besides Yeciat Mitzrayim, which seems very important, at least if you look in the Chumash, in many places. It's so ganz wichtig. And it's man gewollt wissen, was ist wichtig, oder wie also ist es wichtig. I'm gonna mute people. If you want, then you could talk, but it's macht noise. Und sie haben gesagt, bei Emes, wo gedacht von der Rambam, weil ist der, was jeder eine weiß, wo es ist ja wichtig. Und sie haben gesagt, von der Shitas, von der gelernt, 3, 4, 5 andere Mekoiris von der Rambam, was ich kann kicken, free in the pages. I could send you the whole document. Maybe I send it to you, or I keep on changing it. Was kommt aus von der Rambam, ist, also Yeciat Mitzrayim ist nicht wichtig, at least nicht Yeciat Mitzrayim für sich. Das heißt, das so, lass mir verzeihen ein bisschen Maß, was man kann verzeihen am Maß. Also. Zu verstehen, was ist der big deal of Yeciat Mitzrayim, Piep Schat, das ist nicht ganz sagen, was man darf beklau suchen an Schied, wegen dem jeder einer versteht. Wir gehen in Mitzrayim, mit der Rose von Mitzrayim, that sounds like a pretty damn good thing. It doesn't sound like something that some Rosh Hashiva has to come and quetscht sich, kneitscht sich die Stirn and say it's a pilpul, zum Asbazan, was ist der größte Indien. So it's a ganz größte Indien. Also Menschen gehen in Mitzrayim, ist raus. And if you're a little bit mamen, dann versteht sich, man darf man danken der Eibestra auf dem, man darf nicht weich sein auf dem, und es darf Zeide gedenken, jede Jahr, ich weiß. Es ist eine ganz normale Sache, ganz eine pushte Sache, man darf nicht, es fehlt nicht, es ist viele funny zu fragen auf dem, Akasha. If you think about it like this, you realize that the Akasha doesn't really make sense. Aber so the Torah so viel geredet wegen Yeciat Mitzrayim, because that's a big major deal. That's mein du halb Sekunde quetschen ich finde you could like make national stories and talk about how this is the source of your whole story of how everything starts here and things like that. Sei push it mit gewöhnen Mitzrayim mit der Rose gegangen. Das ist ein großer Deal. Und wegen dem ist mir hier bei größte Schkoech zu geben für die Eibestehen, gesagt zu reden wegen dem und na so weiter. Und das ist lechoide der Pshat, mein at least eine von der Pshutim, oder der Push der Pshat, was Rav Yidin haben verstanden, wenn sie gelernt, wegen Yeciat Mitzrayim, Peisach, und sie gemacht das Seider, und gesagt, Zippi Yeciat Mitzrayim, man kann noch herankicken, es ist noch ein sehr wichtiger Rahmen, was versteht sich vergessen, ich kann nicht vergessen, aber wenn ich umkomme letzte Mal, und darf herankicken, und Rambam Menilches Chumas Imatze, Peirik sein, meine ich, die leicht darauf die Mitzvah von Zippi Yeciat Mitzrayim, und auch das Sefer Mitzvah, das Mitzvah, as I kifni in Zion, wie sucht der Indien von Zippi Yeciat Mitzrayim, was ist Peisach Banach. Das ist nicht dieselbe Mitzvah von, ich suche nicht Yeciat jeden Tag, ja, sie die Achrone mitchen sich, was der Chilik ist, aber es ist nicht du echt eine Mitzvah in der Rama, was ist stark der andere. Weil Kapunem, es ist manchmal dort sehr klar, als der Indien ist, aber man darf sich, als der Chalazung, der Luschen der Rama von Sefer Mitzvah ist, ich kann nicht mal ein Paper do. Es Shiar hat wurden bei Gdulas mach usluni Hashem, mach usluni Mitzrim, va ich luka Hashem, nek musaini mahem, il hoy dois loyes al kol atoyv shegmeluni. Und das ist tatsch kol amarbele sapra, da ist mir schmeckt, wie sag mehr mit mich bei da bestimmen. Mit der Dank da bestimmen, so wie viel Teufel hat getan, wie viel das ist der größte Sache von Yeciat Mitzrayim. Es ist nicht dafür eine Sache, was darf sein Hesbe, was darf etwas am mehr hat wie lach mit dem Azam, was ist der große Markolera. Das ist der Push der Pshat, und das ist heute auch das steht in der Rambam. In das Yeciat Mitzrayim, in so da ich noch auf Plätze was der Rambam heute like der Rambam sie noch auf Kneitschen in dem der Rambam hat ein Kneitsch versucht, dass no was der Rambam sucht in der Gabe Shabbos, was ist eine von der größten Mekoides, das der Pusik in Liches in der Tashis Chanan sucht das Shabbos is zeig auch Yeciat Mitzrayim. In der Rambam lernt etwas, als wir bald man kann in Mitzrayim, aber man kennt nicht in Shabbos, ist der was ist mein Afshir, als ein Mensch, der kennt nicht in Shabbos, das ist Yeciat Mitzrayim. Das ist sicher der von Ezra Pshat dort, by the way. Letzte Woche haben wir sich gematcht, sie steht pinklich, was der Rambam meint. Es kicken der von Ezra dort in Liches Schnees zu sehen, bringt sogar der Pshat, und der Rambam auch, bringt die zwei Pshutim dort auf dem Platz. Bringt der von Ezra, bringt der Rambam, der Stückel Meur auf unserem gelernt. Und der Ramban denkt sich auf dem sehr stark, mit umkämpfen der Shit des Ramban. Aber das ist doch heute der Push der Pshat, man kann sie like der Kneitsch, ein Kneitsch, was der Ramban sie geliked das. Als Days, was unser Rost von Mitzrayim, Days lost ins machen, kann viele sagen, Hand Peisach, ja, Days, was man feiert Peisach, will sagen alle Mus, dass die Kehele hier von Mitzrayim, ist dann mal geht der Weg von den Verstehen. Es ist nicht nur also wie okay, man macht eigentlich die Show, was es geillig hier zu Mitzrayim. Die Menschen, die sind in Mitzrayim, sie sitzen nicht sicher nicht bei Seife, bei der Peisach, und machen eine Seite. So, das, was man kann machen eine Seite, das, was man, es ist, du eine Möglichkeit, sie sagen, wenn ich hören. Das ist allein, also wie scheurisch für die machende Mitzvah bei sich. So, it's like you're it's show and tell, there's buhurig beraglov, ja, der was es du. Ist schon heraus mit rein. Das ist selbe Sach Shabbos, oder alle anderen mit dem kann man noch verstehen, warum es auf alle mit sucht man sagen, das ist mit rein. Weil mit rein, wenn wir nicht stecken, nicht speisen, nicht schon, nicht keine von der Sachen. Das ist heute der Rambam schreibt. Die zweite Sache, wo der Rambam sie gelegt, gab Peisach und Sukkos, dass es da mit der Teuwe zu gedenken, wie mai hat Teuwe, wie mai heru. Wenn es ein Mensch geht, hat nicht hier zu vergessen, als Samuel gewinnt schlecht, am Ending. And this was in so ein Peisach, und man macht sich Mori es Chayayim, man esst Murer, oder Sikkes geht nach Rosen Sikke, da meint man sich, das ist mit der Teufel, der Mensch soll sich geschalten, als groß, er soll gedenken zu danken. Das sind noch zwei Kneitsch, was der Rahmen mit sie geliked, aber das warte, sei simpel, sei ja. Okay. Jetzt du a zweite Jid, seit Geist in der Ramban. And the Ramban sei generally, in general, sei eine interessante Sache, sie der Rambam, die ganze Theology, und Kolotere Kille. Was der Ramban ist, gleibt der Rambam, in einer gewissen Wege, viele mehr wie der Rambam allein hat sich gegleibt, aber dreht es über totally upside down. Eine andere Werte, lass me verstehen, also. Der Rambam hat mechadisch gewinnt, die größte Sache, das ist der dritte Point, der Rambam, was man gefällt, der Ende von letzte Schier. Der Rambam hat bei Emmes gehalten, als die alle Maßes und die alle Mitzvahs, sei seine nur Kleinigkeiten, das sind saatige Sachen. Das sind Sachen, wo sind beikele viele, schon der Rambam ist beikele viele Amateure Scheune, was ist dick nach Gif, Menschen darf nur geht Middes, a viele die Sachen geht Middes, nicht der echte Schleimes von der Mensch, der echte Matur von der Mensch ist nur, es loben geht da ist, was man kann nicht von richtige Minnes, aber Emmes die richtige Dweikes, richtige Das. Und alles andere ist eigentlich getimmt, uns zu kommen zu dem. Wir haben uns gesagt, dass bei Emmes laut der Rambam viele Sipizis im Zerayim, es ist eine größere Mitzvah, es ist ein Weg, sie machen Propaganda für den Mann, das ist der Rambam wegen Mitzvah von Shabbos. Aber die Ecke-Sache, was ist wichtig, die Ecke, Mechiven, die Neshumme, die Ecke-Sache, was ist Emmes genau wichtig, das ist die Amina Alliance, oder die Yedi Alliance, die Das Alliance. Das ist ein das Rambam. So, der Rambam gibt mir die Chiddisch, lassen wir noch so ein Klur. Der Rambam gibt mir die aufrassende Jüdischkeit, das war sagen, der Lese kommt mit das, und so gerät wegen dem Zayras Achmon von anderen Points of View. Und kommen wir sagen, Masha Atem Royem, Mitzvahs Massies, in Mitzvahs Massies darf man zielegen auch das Narratives Massies, ja, Sippe, die ist mit Zerayim, nicht nur die Mitzvah von Verzeilen, nur die Sippe, die Masse, als ich bin am Zerayim, der Eibisch der Rost, und den Banken nehmen, die ganze Masse. So der Rambam, das ist Zatig, das ist ein heiche Timze. Der Emmes-dige Icke-Sach, der Emmes-dige Tam, der Emmes-dige Kavune, und auch der Emmes-dige Weg von Mekaim sein, ist nur die Sache, was heißt das, die Sache, was heißt der Minne, das meint, man darf wissen, the truth, darf wissen der Emmes von der Welt, darf wissen wegen Gott, was ist der Icke der Emmes, was man darf wissen, und wie sie auf der Welt, und alles. Und alles ist nur ein Weg, wie sie das sie auslernen, oder man farsen sein, oder was. Jetzt, der Ramban, nicht nur der Ramban, alle Jiden, was gehen bei Ikfes der Ramban, da Adaya Mazeh, haben ungenommen der Rambam Lichatzuhr in einer gewissen Weg backwards. Alle Maschgichen, alle Ehrlichen sind Moide, als der Iker ist man darf der Iker Dweikes, die wichtigste Sache Aid, was macht nur alle Mitzvahs, macht nicht Dweikes, macht hat nicht keine Minne, wo man sagen so, hat nicht keine Minne, ist nicht geneig, jeder eine gedenkt noch zu sagen, der Ramban in der Ende von Parshas Boi, was sagt das? Als der Kavune von allen Mitzvahs ist zu sagen, zu sagen, als so eine Minne, als so eine Kude, Bashem, als so warte. Aber, ja, schon für jener Ramban kann man sehen, sie lernen es backwards. Nicht wie bald bei Matura sind Minne, Meile der Mitzvah-Maß ist nicht so wichtig, Meile der alle Nissen sind nur gemacht bei den Narunen, wo sie verstehen nicht, wenn man sie maß bei der Point, darf man sie was nach Maß, also wie ein Slide, ein Show, ein Movie. Nicht das, sondern pink verkehrt. Wie bald das Kala-Kala-Kille, sie kommen zu sagen, in jede kleinste Mitzvah ist kommen auch zu sagen, ist doch die kleinste Mitzvah, so ich wie die größte Mitzvah. Das ist literally Lushna Ramban in Sofparshas Boi. Und dann muss man gerne bringen. Oder dasselbe Sache wegen Shabbos. Lass mir umgehen, den Muschel von Shabbos. in der Rambam is wel, das geht sehr klar de Chilik. De Emes, was uns davon wissen, ist Matura Schnie. Das heißt, das ist du aber Schäfe. Nicht dafür la sag mehr von dem. In Shabbos versteht sich Welt, und darf man drauf normale Menschen als auch hören dafür. In normale Menschen verstehen nicht, wenn man sein Masber, das Aristo hat gesagt, dass du aber Schäfe. Man sagen Shabbos, gescheiß ist muss Hashem, wird es gelungen. Ein kommt aus, was ist Chushev, nicht Shabbos ist Chushev. Die Idee ist Hashem ist Chushev. Shabbos ist ein heiche Timze von dem, aber Shabbos ist nicht Chushev. Kommt der Ramban, kommt der andere mit Forschung, so ein Pink verkehrt. Ob Shabbos ist ein Nora Weg mit dir ist Hashem, ist Shabbos ist Chushev, nicht nur Shabbos ist Chushev. Shabbos ist also Chushev, wie ist es Chushev, der Eizem Amina, der Eizem Metzies, wie dir ist Hashem. Es kommt aus, wie eine funny Sache, eine Muschel. Bei Seid Rambam und Seid den Ramban sind immer, das ist auch noch besteht in der Gemurre. Besteht, als Shabbos Shabbos ist Schukul Kolatoire Kille, ja, weißt es Michal Shabbos Verfrestie, heißt Schukul Kisovia Go, steht in der Gemurre. Und es steht in Verkehrt, weißt es Schäume Shabbos, das Kille ist Mekaim Kolatoire Kille. Es in der Rambams shit mein des azoi. Kolatoire Kille ist dich noch gekommen, du da zu verzeihen, als du a Gott. Der Shabbos ist genig, beizem. Shabbos ist nicht, weil Shabbos ist wichtig. Das, was man sagt, dass Machal Shabbos ist ein Oiver, ist ein Apekoir, ist nicht Machal Shabbos, ein Apekoir. Machal Shabbos ist ein Machal Shabbos. Aber das ist sehr wichtig, wie bald das ist ein Weg, was verkauft. Das ist eine Propaganda. Machal Shabbos, raster auf Design, was steht, dass du aber Schäfe. Und wie bald Menschen sind so stupid, dass ohne Sein verstehen sind, ist sehr wichtig zu hängen, das Sein. Aber der Ramban, kijkt es Pink verkehrt. Kijkt so, als eines Shabbos ist dich gekommen, zum Fahrs, dass du aber Schäfe. Du bist Machal Shabbos, bist der Apekoir. Nimmt tun, als es viele nicht macht, was sagt, weil kijkt tun, Kelly, vergesst der Chilik von Design mit der Sache, wo Design verkauft. Das heißt, ob Shabbos ist das Sein, als Gescheiß ist, ja, man weiß, auf der Schein ist nicht verkauft. Er kennt sein, als nicht verkauft, aber darf man fragen, at least. It doesn't entirely add up, die Weg, was der Ramban hat uns ausgelernt, versucht, dass wie bald der Mitzvah von Shabbos ist nur ein Weg von so kritisch Eulam, oder als absolut sagt, für Meile wird man Apekoir, es wird nicht Apekoir. Ich meine, der Mann ist auch Moida, er wird nicht immer so Apekoir. Aber bei ihm arbeitet die ganze Logik verkehrt, und das kommt von dem, weil ungenehm der Rambam lechimre, nicht lekille. Nimmt tun die Sache als es ein Minne, nimmt auch tun, als alle mit zusammen zu Team mit dem Minne, aber nicht in der Weg, was der Rambam hat verstanden, als der Heiche Timmt sind, der Minne bleibt noch als der Emmes, die gesagt, noch als du Achillik von beiden, aber pinkt verkehrt. Der Mitze, der viele kennst du mit, am Mitze von Zitzes, sagt der Ramban, ist schon ein Minne, weil das war's schon, aus der Minne, und so weiter. Meile, der Mitze von Zitzes, befnei Atzmoy, kann sein Chushev, also wie der Mitze von der Minne, oder das auch Mitze. Das ist der very general switch, was der Ramban auch geteint zu der Rambam's Theology, was alle immer sehr laut von der Switch, weil du echte Loch, was macht nicht entirely sense, in my opinion.
I said, so the Judi was so good as the Rambam actually says that too.
That too, that what?
As all these things are part of not just bringing you to a midah or showcasing a midah or whatever, propagating for a midah, but this was also, if God told you to do that, in order to do that, and you're not accepting it, then that means that you don't believe. If God told you to remember this way,
sicher nicht. Jens sagt viel der Ramban sagt nicht Jens im Ganzen. Jens ist so wie was aber Mr. Baltani war gesagt. Nein, Jens ist schon noch ein Level.
Is there a place where we shall be start harayi gekaufen bevor der Killer?
So steht ja, nein.
Steht schon was sagt, eine was soll man kaufen.
Nein. Das heißt, da viele der Ramban sagt nicht, dass geht nicht mit der Swude, was du gewiss, dass ich erkennen, was vor allem zu trachten wegen dem, dass jeder eine steht eine Virus nach Bekoir, was kommt doch aus der gleiche. Das damals ist das, ich glaube ja nicht nicht, that doesn't really work. Was der Ramban sagt, ja, ist dass there's something more inherent. He doesn't separate the
Ich verstehe, forget if it works, if it doesn't work. Aber der Konzept, dass der Mann, wie steht das Sache, der eine Titel sagt, ich kaufe bevor der Killer. Wie steht das Sache?
Nein, das steht auf Shabbos, steht nicht noch so viel mal.
Steht auf Tal Shabbos, ja, ich kaufe bevor der Killer. The thought process for this is the Rambam is saying, that's just a joke because it's just to promote it. The Basel, as I've gesagt.
Der Rambam quote die Sachen und Und sie haben gebringt, die Kicklats friest, zu sehen, wie sie pinklich der Rambam like darauf, gleich aber Shabbos, man darf kicken, selbe Sache, Pavel gab aber der Sura. Und der Rambam hat nur zwei Wege, wie man kennt, sein echt, dass wie gekauft wird, alle Teure Kelle. Eins ist, ob man es Taka kauft. Das heißt, so wie der Rambam sagt in Yidel Meikrim, wer hat nicht keine Minne, so he's merely, because that's the most important thing, not because that's the only thing that the Rambam really cares about. That's one way. So if you're over the Zura, if you look in the Rambam Zura, you'll see the Rambam trying to build up an idea that says that if you don't have the correct faith, so you're basically a goy. Just because of that, not because of any pshatel, nicht very directly. Says nicht weil auf der Zura is a große Mitzvah, as wär's Lowy for the Zura is a shayget. That's not the Rambam's way of thinking. The Rambam's way of thinking is if you believe in the Zura and the way that you're not allowed to believe, you are automatically a shayget. I don't really need any gemuras. Nicht that's a große chimre from. That's why it's nicht echt the pshat for any members. That's why the Rambam was moitzi those members in Leib and will the Chazal do mean it in a way that this is a große Nevaira, so it's kille over the Zura. Der Rambam sagt es nicht so. Der Rambam sagt es, die bist a goy. Plain, weil Yid meint, wer sich gleibt in einer gewissen List von true Dagpas. And then du andere Sachen, der Rambam bringt sie auch, also wie Shabbos. Und der Rambam sieht das, sie machen eine klare Chilik zwischen den zwei Sachen, was jene bringt die ja, bis da betar Mama Chazal, betar Sam Hagzome. Und na viel Leute du a Lochele gabe dem, oder Muschel da Lochele von Chil Shabbos, der Rambam like sie beferisch bei in Hilchas Shabbos, as the reason for this is that Shabbos is a us, Vaino, Yevayim, B'nai Yisrael, nish. So in other words, he doesn't use the thing you would expect him to use, which is to say that whoever doesn't keep Shabbos in Apikoides, and everyone knows that Rambam holds in Apikoides, is a Kegoy the Chol Dvurov, and Rambam in Hilchas Eides sucht, as of Apikoides, davon ist dafür a Gemure, weil sie looking as a Pusel Eides Lamush. Weil Apikoides is that guy, it's not a question. Someone that's Masache will give, Yavem do Ashtakir in the Gemure, it's going to get a Shai gets as a Pusel Eides. But the halacha of Mechal Shabbos Varesi is in the Rambam's view as a große Shai gets, because he's a Poirik in the Käufer in the Bris, ich weiß was es ist nicht Paket, es kommt mit fertig mit dir in Rambam, also nützt nicht the idea of a minute.
It's like the biggest proof that he's a Shai gets. It's just a, but again, it's a proof that.
Was?
Why is that proof such a? If there is such a thing, maybe the other things are not such a big proof. But there's definitely one mitzvah.
What?
Ultimately, mind is as Thomas Käufer in the bris. From the Tis Shabbos is a raya is Käufer in the bris.
No. That's not what the Rambam says. The Rambam definitely never uses that kind of logic. Because I think that the Rambam never uses such kind of logic and call it a killer. Because the Rambam belief is a very
Poirik in the bris.
No. Look at Käufer. Shabbos is us. The best is nicht, a goy, and like one way of saying you're Yid is because you belong to the Schever Shamre Shabbos. The Rambam kaimel in Kol Teire Killer doesn't ever resort to this kind of logic that says because this is such a big avaira, you're apikoides. There's no second order apikoides in the Rambam. Why? Because the Rambam was one that invented thought crimes as a category by themselves and put them
your question. So, is the Rambam, so are you saying that the Rambam says that Shabbos is a thought?
No, okay. Shabbos is nicht a thought. Nein. Shabbos is obviously not a thought because it's just not. Shabbos is an action. Or they eat me Shabbos, or they eat me Shabbos. The Rambam is a clue in his reality. The Rambam, what I'm saying is because the Rambam invented thought crime as a category, and he said that category is the most important, he didn't have to connect it as the old-fashioned way, and Chazal probably would mix it in with all kinds of different things. I think this mind that the tracht. The Rambam doesn't have any minds that the tracht, but the Rambam trachten mind trachten. It's very direct. There's no second order.
I'm sorry, Geitzrik. So what's mind the Rambam Shab Lamasav and Shab? So why?
That doesn't mean for real.
Doesn't mean for real.
No, definitely. Of course not. Obviously not. Because the Shoyme Shabbos is not one of those people that says Nilchas Havedazura and Nilchas Chiva that he's Kigoy Azavia Goy Valhotch Kanamina. Of course not. It's not in the same category at all.
Okay.
Man darf mit Mechayke sein, es wäre nicht 1000% fertig, but that's my feeling that I get. Jetzt, the Chitz von der ganze Sache, so that's generally what happens in the interplay between thought and actions, we could say, in general, in Kol Teire Killer. Yeah, was gescheit is, because the Ramban agreed with the Rambam and somewhat agreed more than the Rambam himself. Why? What? In what sense did he agree more than the Rambam himself? Because he doesn't really accept the idea of signs or the idea of propaganda. He really understands that everything is only about real amina, and he doesn't accept that there should be things that are second order to that in the way of the Rambam is most tamei mitzvahs are only second order, that this is going to lead you and maybe it's going to make a nice society and eventually can sein ein chochem guy weiß the Rambam story. So he has to go back and say that Yetzias Mitzrayim, he can't really accept that it should be so important just for weiß man der Ausgang von Mitzrayim. This episode stimmt nicht in der Rambam's Kopf. And the Ramban hat gekommen, and he's the first one that I know. Man darf man da exam in Rashi, man darf man da exam in Amur Chazal as usual. But the Ramban has gekommen, the first one, and he said that Yetzias Mitzrayim is very important, and its meaning, the meaning of Yetzias Mitzrayim changes by him. The meaning of Yetzias Mitzrayim in the Ramban is nicht so gestreut haben wir raus von Mitzrayim, and auch nicht die andere zwei meanings, as the Rambam hat gesagt. Nor the meaning, and es ist sicher nicht die Sache, was es nur für also wie Amon Am und also weiter. No, the meaning for Yetzias Mitzrayim is that this shows, and when we affirm it, we agree to everything that Eid has to believe, and nicht everything that Eid has to believe, not everything that Eid has to believe. The Lowy Aristotelian Yidden was gleich nicht in them. That's more or less what the Ramban does. Man darf das wasen in a weinig. So kann ich wasen also.
Again, the Rambam uses those words, but you're saying that he uses just...
No, the Rambam doesn't use those words. Never about Yetzias Mitzrayim.
Sure. The Rambam says, "Mat gemacht die Mosem and Nissen by Yetzias Mitzrayim."
You ask me because Rambam. Nicht das Rambam. It's not Rambam.
Nicht the Loykar Aristotelian. He doesn't say that part.
No, he doesn't say anything. He never feeds those, and wegen den gleibt man in etwas. Ich kann zu wasen in a minute. Du hast Rambam. Aber du weißt, dass Rambam sagt noch. Ich weiß nicht.
What do you mean? The Rambam sagt, dass Magdatin Mosem in Yitzchok, when he speaks about Mosem, that gewisse times God did Mosem.
No, the Rambam very openly says that Mosem don't prove anything, and we don't believe any Mosem. Right. In der Rambam sagt nicht so. Die was noch weiß nicht, dass der Rambam steht nicht der Rambam. Die kennst das Drusche, die Yetzias Mitzrayim weiß, dass mindestens nicht du als Rambam. Der Rambam hat nicht jene Drusche.
Nicht, dass weiß, dass
nicht jene Drusche. Was?
Sagt, dass der Eibisch hat gemacht, Mofsem auf gewisse Zeiten?
Nein, der Rambam sagt nicht. Der Rambam sagt nicht verkehrt. Der Rambam sagt, der Eibisch macht nicht kein Mofsem zu weisen, gut nicht. Der Rambam sagt, dass der Eibisch macht Mofsem, weil man hat ein Problem.
Right.
That's what Rambam in Soida Teure Parik Chest, also from last week.
So why is saying that? Okay, but because we have a problem, we all have that problem. So it's similar to the Sadia Guin, this part of like that it's a process. It's one of those, because we have a problem or whatever, because why isn't that does the Rambam says because there was a problem, God had to make a moifus every now and then.
A physical problem, no, not a faith problem. The Rambam doesn't need mofsim, he hates him or whatever. We just had
to cross the water. That was
yeah, that's what it says. There was a water and they wanted to cross, so they made a moifus. Nicht weil man gewollt etwas wasen. The Rambam doesn't have...
One second. There isn't that place where Shrap, for what man sagt, nicht Hand kann aufsehen. That happened one time.
That's the Ramban. The Rambam is very against that. The Rambam doesn't need mafsim. The Rambam thinks that mafsim are bad. The Rambam...
Why did he even cross the Yamsuf to get to the other side?
Exactly. That's the Rambam's shit. And how do we know there is a God? Because we see him or because we understand, not because of any stories or any lessons. That's shit is the Rambam. Kim lernen was der Ramban sagt, weil ich davon komme, was der Ramban. Jetzt der Ramban hat gegangen in seine andere Schitte. Ich kann müssen lernen, at least die Stücke Ramban von Barnes, wo es jeder eine weiß. And there steht noch einmal in seinem Sefer Torah Shem Tamimu, if you want to get a better context of what he's really arguing with, you could read it over there. And the Ramban hype, the Ramban hype tun fin the Indian fin mitzvahs tefillin. Let's learn and maybe we'll clarify afterward. So there's this mitzvah tefillin that says that the steht in der Pusik, Heule, Heule, Oisal, Yodchul, Man, Tietor, Hashem, Fichu, Ki, Biyot, Chazoko, Yitziach, Hashem, Mitzrayim. Na, ähnlich steht in der nächste Parche von Film. Ja. Was ist das? Ki, Biyot, Chazoko, Yitziach, Hashem, Mitzrayim. Let's read the second one. Zog the Ramban. Wenn Scheuer schon Mitzvah soll, schon nicht Ksavi Yitzias Mitzrayim al Yad val Rosh, kneg der Lev HaMoich, schon nicht Ksamach Shuva. Wenn nicht der Parshas Kadosh Voike Viach Betuvis na Mitzvah soll, schon Stavani beim Las Yitzias Mitzrayim, der Tuvis werden. Eines steht in der Parshas von Kadosh Voike Viach und Sof Parshas Boy. Es verstehen, haben wir Chazal verstanden, dass die Ingen von Yitzias Mitzrayim das zu machen in Sia, der Tufo ist bei einer Neichu. In der andere zwei Parshas Shema von Shema steht auch, dass die jene Mitzvah sollen auch machen in Sia, der Tufo ist bei einer Neichu. Wegen dem schreiben ins die alle Mitzvahs auf die schreiben in die alle Parshas, dann legen es darauf auf den Hand und auf den Moich. Jetzt, what's the real story? Zog the Ramban an so. The klal betam mitzvahs rabbis. Now this is the Ramban's way of reading the reason of asach mitzvahs and efshir alle mitzvahs, efshir kol mitzvahs kilom. Al kapunem asach mitzvahs. Da ist der Heine al kapunem de asach mitzvahs steht bei sei Yitzias Mitzrayim, also wie Tefillin, and also wie Shabbos, was man geht sehen, and also wie the actual mitzvah von der Minna, was man geht auch sein. So der Ramban also, so du gewähne als Sachmensch, du verschiedene Sorte Isen, was der Ramban is worried about. So gewähne der Aufgabe des Hure, wenn man erinnerst, um Menschen umgehen zu machen, die Isen. Jetzt so gewähne verschiedene die Isen, and the Ramban is very kind of confused. Ich kann sich schon confused. Aber he confuses different Isen and makes them into one twist. What's the größte Sache, was the Rambam will sollen wissen? If you read, now this is, again, you have to be very good medayik in the Rambam and the erste Peirik von Hilchus Avodah Zorah, was the Rambam's problem with Avodah Zorah is the emes. And it's learn as to say, as the Rambam sagt, the Rambam read, by the way, that's a place that the Rambam okay, Chalom kommt zurück zu the Rambam noch später. And the Rambam sagt, as the story is, koiden called hat jeder einer gewiss, dass du a Gott, ein anderer Wetter, a Sibber Scheine. Nimm dich hier, wenn man ziehst. Später kommen Menschen, haben gesagt, dass man darf dienen verschiedene Avodah Zorah, mit Keuches, mit Masulis, mit Sins, mit Levunis, andere Sachen. And for with all kinds of Svuris. And slowly, they forgot about the original one. Now, the Rambam's problem is that. The Rambam's problem is gewesen, als am vergessen, ich weiß nicht, welcher Reben. This. The Rambam's problem is, as I'm forgetting the erste Mechiv HaMetzias. I'm forgetting Mechlal. In other words, the Rambam's problem with Avodah Zorah is not that du atuas, was Avodah Zorah sagt, Uza Hashem Esuretz and the Eibish defeat the Welt doch Sibis doch Teva, because that's actually true. And the Ramban also agrees that it's true, by the way, but that's the Ramban just has a different answer to that. But that's actually true. The Rambam's problem is when you get too busy with that, you become an atheist. You forget the whole idea of God. That's how the Rambam stands of Zorah. And the Rambam says very clearly that the problem for the Zorah is when they start forgetting about God. And that's what happened in Mitzrayim and Moshe Rabbeinu Fatzal Eden. Yodu God. Kim the Ramban. Now, there's another kfira, which, of course, didn't really exist, really existed, but it's very famous in the Rambam Satan and the Ramban Satan. What this heißt, Oilam Kadman, which both in the Rambam's and in the Ramban's view, this is very much connected with the idea of Ashgocha. For verschiedene reasons. Andere Werte is not connected to the idea of Ashgocha, it's connected very stark with the idea of Teva and Nes. In the way that the Rambam in Moira understood it, and the Ramban agrees, just he argues, he's on the other side of the debate. Andere Werte was the pshat. According to the understanding of the Chevre, the Rambam, and the Aristotelians that he read, in the Indian Fin, the Deirach HaTeva, from what we call the law of nature, what they understood was that there are certain immutable laws, so we discussed about, right? Necessary laws. There's certain necessary laws, which is how the reality has to be. And these laws are immutable, and they're the reason for almost everything that we know, almost everything in nature, everything that we see, they're because of those laws. Now, therefore, they connected that with that means that there isn't really a reason, so there isn't really a possibility, let's talk about. There isn't really a possibility for all these things to be different in any direction. It's not possible for water to be not water, for example. It's mamish impossible in their view, because the reason why water is obviously because it's necessarily water, because that's how Aristotle got to understand nature and the end of everything, according to their understanding. And to machen Wasser nicht Wasser is plain impossible. So it's looking 1 is 4. It's plain impossible. And in the same way, it's also impossible for it not to exist, because if it would not exist, then something would have to make it exist. And they don't like the idea of having a God that does that for whichever reasons. So therefore, the world has to ever necessarily always existed. That doesn't mean, this meint nicht, this meint nicht, that the Eibishter is nicht the reason, the cause of the world. He is internally the cause of the world, but it's a missed existence. It's a mischayev, as the world should clearly get caused by something called a God, which is obviously a different kind of God than the Jewish God, but as is. Okay? This is the...
What's the problem with that?
What's the problem with was?
With that thought process?
Was is an Altstisse?
Yeah, nicht this, because why can't we
believe that? So
yeah.
According to the Rambam, this is less apikarsa than a lot of other things. Because at least it believes and it has the correct concept of a one God. So the Rambam actually said very openly that he's pretty happy. This is like the biggest, one of the big controversy in the Rambamism. It's nicht von Hand, noch von der Schmiel Tibbens times. The Rambam is kemat beferish as is ganz zufrieden as man soll gehen mit der Shittas Akademis, because it clarifies the existence of God better. And he really only cares about the existence of God. He doesn't really care about anything else. He really only has. This is at least the most important thing to him. This is Shittas Rambam. Yet, of course, the Rambam said that Olam Kadmon is a big problem for us. And why is it a big problem? Precisely because of this idea. Because this actually means that God is powerless to change anything in the world. In other words, anything that we call Nisim, which, again, in their understanding, in their understanding, a Nes, by definition, means that we break a law of nature, because otherwise it's not a Nes. So that's impossible, according to this whole understanding. So therefore, the Rambam himself says that Olam Kadmon will have to change most of Amina, because it can't match with Nisim, and Nisim are very important. At least the possibility of Nisim, not that it should actually happen, because the Rambam almost never believes they actually happen, but at least in principle that God should be free from the constraint of the laws of the world is very important to him. And therefore, takes that problem.
What I can understand is, the field of Rambam, is there no special significance to the fact that it just so happened to be that Yetzias Mitzrayim needed so many Nisim, so many technical problems? There was that story. Yeah. Between the Deis and Makis and the Cheshkudel and the whole business, the story needed so many technical interventions.
Let's try to learn the Ramban. Ich darf zurückkommen zu der Ramban. The Rambam doesn't have, just like he doesn't have a problem with Kol HaTorah Killa. It's stories for the children and so weiter. And you have to also remember that the Rambam would probably minimize the Nisim, and he doesn't really believe there's that many Nisim as you're counting. So, das darf man allemal gedenken. Okay. Is jetzt, ich will zurückgeben zu der Rambam. So, this is the gewesen eine von der größten Problems, was I haben gehabt. Now, in the Ramban looks at it, and I'm giving you a kitzur of, if you read Torah Shem Tumim, you see him hacking very openly on the Rambam in this point. And the problem was the Ramban had got with the kind of idea, was like Olam Kadmon of Latzvait. In other words, in the Rambam's view, now that whatever the Rambam actually is true, so-called view about Olam Kadmon is, it's definitely a second-class citizen by him. Even the idea of Nisim and the idea of miraculous Hashgucha, which is like something that comes out of that, is a second-class citizen by the Rambam. The Ikir is the idea Hashem, idea that there is a Mechiv Metzias. That's the most important thing. Everything else is secondary to him. Kim the Ramban, and Ramban zog that doesn't make any sense. But what's that doesn't make any sense? Because that's not only like a secondary thing, that is Kol HaTorah Killer. Because the Kol HaTorah Killer is, zog the Ramban, is saying that the whole idea of the Torah, in the Ramban's view, has to do with the idea of Schar v'Onesh. Has to do with the idea that wer es geht man Schar, wer es schlecht, geht man Onesh. Zog the Ramban, jeder eine weiß, dass this is nicht kein legal, this is nicht kein natural law. Nicht doing Kol HaTorah Killer, and this is, by the way, a big fear of the Ramban. In other words, here he's masking very sharply with the Rambam that the Teva is Olam K'men Noig. That the Teva has nothing to do with your merit. That the nature doesn't care at all if you're a tzaddik or a rusha. And of course, this is not so simple because even the Ramban's Talmidim already argued on this very sharply, and some claim that this doesn't really add up. If you have a really religious view of the universe, you can't really say that. But the Ramban does understand like that. In other words, it is maskim as the Derech HaTeva. The Derech HaTeva, in other words, the way the world works, before there was Ma'amad HaSinai, before there was Ovis, and before there was the Yetzias Mitzrayim and Ma'amad HaSinai, which was changed something, okay, was actually, as maybe the Rambam thinks the world works, more or less. Because that's the reality. Maybe once in a while there was a big, huge tzaddik like the Ovis, was geschehen a nes, this he calls a nes nister. In other words, that's not even attached. We wissen, was the Ramban sagt, wenn wegen Nest. This is the Anuke von Shem Shaddai. Shem Shaddai, Nest Nister means, Amur du a riesige Tzaddik, we broke the whole law of nature for him, and we made that he should have a child just because he's a Tzaddik, and not because the necessity of nature caused him to have a child. That's a Nest Nister in the sense that it doesn't openly break a law of nature. So, Krednish as a Gwein HaKure. Krednish as a Gwein HaTzaddik, and there's a Nest Nigel is attached. That's the nisim that come from Shem Havai that Moshe Rabbeinu did. This mind, as Megat Zbrech Tzeras and the Yamsuf, there's not a real difference between a Nest Nigla and a Nest Nister in the hardship of them, right? Because both are impassable. Both are impassable. Just one, it's obviously weird, and the other one doesn't look so weird. But they're both just as impassable, and both don't really happen. In the nature, they never happen. Yes.
By the way, just what does it mean by V'yasiyut and Kedgaya Yam? What does fish symbolized him that there's no
the Ramban obviously agrees. So the Ramban agrees to the Rambam that fish don't have Ashgacha Prutis. The Ramban, by the way, that's why the Ramban is very close to the Rambam here. He agrees. Number one, that is maskim as far, but naturally there is no such a thing as Ashgacha. In other words, there's nothing as Char v'Onesh. That's not a law of nature. It's not a law of nature. He even looks at it as going contrary to the law of nature. He needs a miracle, like Mamash Kriyas Yamsif, as they say that Tzaddik Zelakim is Chan Arush, Zelakim Onesh, darf man an Nes. And this is given the Nes, was Ayabish dot gefiert mit the Ovis. That's how he understands the Shem Shaddai. And yet, then they came in Moshe Rabbeinu.
No, but why is it dafke fish? Why is fish? Fish is like obvious, like animals.
No, there's a pusik. He's just quoting a pusik. Yet. Yet. Now this is the weird thing. Yet kim the Ramban zogt, and this is Khitzuk Kitta Shittas Ramban, because then you will read and see, you'll start to understand really what he means, because everyone read this Shittas Ramban a lot of times and didn't get what's going on. Yet Shittas Ramban is as a Kira Moshe Rabbeinu. And he made this big, huge ofras for some point, which was Nisim Niglim. That's called Nisim of Shem Havai. It's meant that jeder eine ken sein. Now, what's the point of those Nisim Niglim according to Ramban? There's not really any point to them. In other words, they're also not really harder than anything else that the Torah talks about. But their only point in the Ramban is a demonstrative point. That can demonstrate to you that nicht, also wie einer andere sagt, das ist impossible, muss impossible. Impossible. But God, the world is actually not necessary. The world is actually not eternal. It was created by God's will. And all of these laws, they're just God's wills. And God, he could randomly stick his hand in and change things. And he always does. Not always, and not to everyone. But only in this, the idea of Klal Yisrael, the whole idea of the Torah is that God chose these chevra, and He said that to you, at least in general, on general terms, if it's an each yid separately, darf man lernen, the Ramban and so from saying was es kommt aus in der End. Aber alle Wochen bleiben kluli, they Volk, wenn sie seinen geht, bekommen sie schar, wenn sie seinen schlecht, bekommen sie auch nicht. This is a nest. And this is a nest to me, the nest, niste, but it's a nest. It's literally a nest because it goes against the law of nature. It needs, in other words, according to Aristotle, it can't be true. At least the way that Ramban understands Aristotle. And because we want you to believe in this nest, we had to create a whole story called Yetzias Mitzrayim, which very openly showed in a Valdestach Reichwetze Vasen, Amul the Tzaddik gestorben, in the end of the day, it's Nisim Nesturim also because it's hard to, it's not like such an obvious proof. So when we split the Yamsef once, that's enough to be an obvious proof that it's possible in principle. And now you'll start to believe, this is the touch as Mina Nisim Haniglim, you start to believe the Nisim Nesturim. That's what the Ramban means to say. And that's, but that's still Nachal Tzariz Gechidish is L'choyre Nof HaYiden, and Fagoim and Kal V'choyim vanish dimension like animals and like oceans and like viruses and all kind of stuff like that. There is no Ashgocha, and then whatever happens, happens. That's the Shittas Ramban. Yet now you will start to understand. Let me read a little bit and then I'll figure out more. So Kim der Ramban sagt, as es gewähnt auf der Welt in Mai dort ähnlich. Und sei es in der Kichashib, du Kofrim be'iker, bäumenem ko'olam kadmon, Kichashib Hashem v'yomer Elohi. Of course, that's a little confused. Either you say olam kadmon, you could still say that God is. But okay. Mehem makhishem v'yidiyusei aprutis. V'omri eichu yuda'al v'yashdai be'elinat, chapusik v'demochet. This was also, of course, a very Aristotelian thing to say that doesn't make sense to talk about God knowing the details of reality for all kinds of complicated reasons. In Mehem, Shiyoidi B'Yidiyah, du besogen, der Eibste weißt ja, in Makhishem Ba'ashgucha, du habt aber nicht kein Ashgucha, he doesn't care. He knows, but he doesn't do anything about it. In der Vayasi, they mention, as Menschen, as Levet Kriyah, ja, Shloi Ashgich, wa'al ben v'ayni mu'am oynish v'eschat, sogen sei, Uzav Hashem es Ure. So these are, according to Ramban, these are three important minutes or three important kfiras that happen. In other words, or 3.5, right? One, McKenzie was Nishdukan got. This is kind of less relevant. It's not really what he's worried about. So but 1.5 or 2 is Oilam Kadman. The Welt is nicht beschaffen geworden, but it's Zoin Hashem, both from Chiddush. Number 2 is you could disagree with Yedias Hashem, Yediyah Prutis, because that God in a general sense knows everything, that they're all agreeing, all these people that he read. And number 3, or number 3.5 is the Inyan von Ashgucha, which is itself the Inyan of Schava Oynish. Very important that Ashgucha means Schava Oynish for him. Ashgucha doesn't mean that the Eibishter macht alles, that's useless. Ashgucha means that the Eibishter macht alles mit der Ashgucha, mit der Cycle, mit der plan. Otherwise, just to say that God does everything, that's not really what any of the Rishonim are talking about when they're talking about Ashgucha. It's good to know. Okay.
Schava Oynish is a nest, by the way?
Yeah. But why? What do you mean why? That's true generally.
Schava Oynish is a nest.
Yes, he says that. Yes. Now, so the Ramban verzeiht das Amas. Jetzt, die kashiert zerlehen bei Eidoi bejuchet. Eibisch dort misratzig werden, a gewisser Fall klar, oder a juchet. Der gemachten sei amoites, beschinim in Hugesh l'oilam v'tivon. Isparel lakol bitla dais weiliklen. The Rambam claims one moifes, one real moifes, in other words, one nes nigla, one breaking of any law of nature by God, this proves all of these 3.5 kfiras, right? That's how he sees it. And the Rambam is moided to this l'choyre. It disproves that in Shukan Ashgocha, that's gemacht an nes, weil sich gespolten die Yamse for him. And Memayla disproves that he obviously knows, and Memayla disproves that he created it. Very important, because in the Ramban's world, uncreated world equals that there's a necessary rules, which means that God can't change them. And of course, it means that there is a God that's like the zero. The moifes, the nest, moirish yesh l'oidem ale am echadcho, v'yedaya mashgiach v'yochel, adkan, v'yedaya mashgiach v'yochel. The kashiyah moifes ahi, nigzet chilla. Now, we could even add some more ikrim to this same thing. Kashia moifsi nigzet chilim pi novi, is bare many oida mitis an avia. If a novi would come first and say, the Eibishter get morgen gesplot in the Yamsef, it's nicht nur ins Weißen, dass the Eibishter hat as Duche and Yavia and Yechoilis and Chiddush, and also prove that the Eibishter has Neviim, right? Kidabra limes navikas v'skaim im zeh ha-Torah killer. So one moifis, according to the Ramban, is enough to prove Kol ha-Torah killer, because this is Kol ha-Torah killer. That's all he cares about Kol ha-Torah killer. And this time the Ramban meint the Pusik, was steht in bei der Mofsen von Yitzias Mitzrayim, was immer akustisch, the man taida ki ani Hashem bekerev u'uretz. Lohoiros, was meint, so he's gonna bring 3 psikim for his 3 ikrim. These are the Ramban's 3 ikrim, just so you know this. Leman taid, eins ist taid, leman taida ki ani Hashem bekerev u'uretz, lohoiros alash duche. This is the third one. Ich bin bekerev u'uretz, andere Wett, das ist nicht lo'uza voice on a mikrim kedat, am nicht so wie der Rambam sagt. As the Welt feeds sich, wenn es noch mikrim. No, the Eibishter is betoch bekeire huretz, and he takes care of everything too. A zweite Sache steht, le man taida kil Hashem huretz, nicht kann nie bekeire huretz. Nie bekeire huretz heißt, aber es duch, Hashem huretz, das was, das ist יידיש, kein Shaloi, sheborem hain, der Tat ist nicht so, ich weiß nicht. A dritte Pusik steht, ke ein kemoini bechol huretz, das was, alle Yechoiles. Ich halte bekoil, einmal, keine kann mich nicht, yes, he has also control. This is the Ramban's Tana. Well, the Mitzrim, the Rambam is having a very anachronistic reading of Mitzrayim, but he's claiming that the Mitzrim, they read Aristotle, and dann getracht, dass they alles Feikes sei gehabt. In der Meile, gegen dem hat Moshe Rabbeinu gesagt, die Psyken, die alle 3 Leman Taidas, gedei zu weisen, dass du, Chaifetz, Ichoiles, Hashgoche, Chiddush. These 3.5 things. Im kein Oises war aufs Magdoilem Eidem Namun va Minas Aboide va Torah killer. Iba jetzt. Now we get to the part of the why there doesn't happen everything. Weil der Eibishter nicht kam aufs jede Dorf, für jede Rusche. Verwusst nicht. Good question. The Ramban doesn't actually answer this question ever. He just assumes that it doesn't. In other words, it really you have to reason backwards. Obviously it doesn't, because we don't have these kind of nissen every day. And this is the pshat as do the spezielle mitzvahs. Now this the end of the Ramban Akasha. The Mensch wäre Akasha, warum darf man so stark in den Mannen in Gedenken Bechol dor v'dor kili Yitzchok Mitzrayim. What was this so wichtig? The Teretz is, you know why? Weil they dor is nicht du kan nes, was man kann wasen für jede Käufe. Weil haben ins Nor, they mass, was man verzeilt noch, that you have to be able to repeat levnaim. Und wegen dem ist es so, Chumetz, du Kuris auf Achilles Chumetz, auf eines Nasch kann kommen beißig, man darf es legen auf der Mezizah, auf der Tfilin, auf der Mezizah, in suchen 2-mal a Tag, in machen a Sikke jede Jahr. Und so ist selbe Sache, a Sach Mitzvahs in a Zeichel Yitzias Mitzrayim, das ist als Eides auf dem Mofsim Schloish, da kann Abkäufe, sondern ich kann nicht sagen, als nicht du, lahakrisch a Minis verlegen, kommt Adkan. So in other words, kommt aus, als was der Ramban versteht in Yitzias Mitzrayim, and in these Nisim of Yitzias Mitzrayim, and generally in the idea of Nisim, but even clearly, is sehr anders, wie der Rambam versteht, und sei verwusst, für 2 Reasons. Koidem kol, weil der Ramban halt, als du in der Ramban's view, the really important ikrim, the really important things that Ida has to know, has to believe, are actually not ones that are naturally true. They're not possible to be known otherwise, right?
That's the Ramban, yes, or the Rambam?
In the Ramban.
Okay.
The Ramban gekommen, let me tell you, the Rambam you never heard of this whole thing. This Mofsim, he actually technically agrees with that, even though he just kind of ignores it. Pabusses days, weil eigentlich hier in der Ramban's Welt zu wissen, dass du die Sache sei let's call it as Duche for very the kids are good. Andere wird der Nestnister wenn Schave eunisch. According to the Ramban, that is the most important thing, and he even tries to pretend that that's what the Mitzrim were confident. This is of course not true. And if you want to andere wird machanot zurück zu dem. And therefore both in the Ramban's view, the Mofsim have a much more important place because they're, let's at least signs, they at least show these Ikrim. That's wenn andere Wetten, es ist sehr wichtig von der Ramban zu halten einfach Zeilen. Nicht, dass du a God, like the Rambam thinks that everything is just the way to say du a God. No, es sei wichtig, nicht nur als Steuer, also das ist rausgehen von Mitzrayim, es sei wichtig zu erzählen, dass der Eibischte kann machen an Ness. Because Kol HaTorah Killer is truly in the idea that the Eibischte can machen an Ness. And secondly, we could say the same thing from backwards. There is no way to know that only from the empirical evidence or from the Ness that showed us that. Because the Ramban agrees, and this is the very important part, the Ramban agrees that if we would just be goyim and we would just be looking around in the reality without the tradition or without the stories of Nissim, we would never be able. Right? You would never be able to know this because it's not true in the basic reality. It's only true in the prophetic reality or in the reality that we know from these Nissim. And therefore, not only we need the Nissim, the Torah themselves needs the Nissim in order, because the Torah is very important for the Torah to be mechadish this whole emena. And number three, like I'm going to say, and the Ramban Zoktis is like clear do, this is actually a big difference between Ayid and Agoy, or between between the people that are called the Noich Hashem Lekech or not, because it's actually, the Ramban actually more or less believes that Agoy doesn't have this kind of Ashgocha and this kind of Nissim Nisturim that Ayid has. Only Yid, because the Ramban has a whole theology of Ashechulak L'chol Amim, as the emes do over the Zurif Hagoyim, as the emes do Mikrim, as the emes do alle Sachen. In other words, just this was the so there's a third way in the which there's like a real thing that the Nissim or the Maas in Yetziat Mitzrayim tieren auf in der Ramban's Welt. Was die alle drei Sachen existieren nicht in der Rambam's Welt und sind bechlal nicht emes und zu einfach wegen, was man kann zurückgehen und sagen, was der Rambam tracht echt wegen der alle Schales. Ich muss sagen, was der Rambam tracht wegen der alle Schales, emes dick. Aber Kalpunem, der Ramban hat sehr stark gechanged die ganze Sache. Yes, and it has a very interesting interplay with, because he learned all of this from the Rambam actually. If the Ramban would have been even a bigger Ma'aman, and he wouldn't believe that the Derech HaTeva is Nishdu Nissim, he wouldn't have this whole problem. And then he would have been able to go back and say, as the Rambam sagt, dass Yetziat Mitzrayim ist eine große Sache, weil man ist rübergegangen der Yamsef. Da würde sagen, als es Kriyas Yamsef, es gibt eine Sache, weil es proof, dass der Aristo nicht gerecht. That's like a very weird way actually of reading things. And
Yitzchok, can I have a 60-second break? Stop the guy to the refrigerator and I'm to drinken.
Kennst du gar nicht, wie du willst.
I don't know this. Give me 60 seconds.
Gar nicht der jetzt.
I'm back.
Okay. So there's, yeah.
Yeah. No.
So there's all these things which the Ramban has a very different view of, and Hayot Haluni Mizeh is as the Yetziat Mitzrayim dit osayr anders, and in Chlomach ausführen deine Kinder. Se kimt aus as in ein Sinn is der Rambam Masach nennt es the emes. I think das Sach nennt es der Schal. Allah is unreal. Es ist ganz klar, dass der Mitzrim am nicht gatt es Schal als efshir der Aristo ist gerecht. Efshir der Eibster nicht maschgier betachtoinem. That's all kind of not true. Efsham ze gat Schal als der Mitzrische Gott ist der emes der Gott, and der Belaheim Mitzrayim es shvutim is nicht. Okay, es hat gebrochen sein Getsch is as simmer as is nicht der richtige Gott. That's the most theology you could find in the Pusik. Regarding arguing with other theologies. I don't think even this whole Leman Taida, if it's a theological statement and not like just a simple statement of saying es wissen, it means to say la fike de Lahai Mitzrayim. Mitzrayim dient man, ich weiß nicht wie der heißt der Lahai Mitzrayim. The Kamash Malon is nicht der nor ich. This idea
why can't we say Lahai Mitzrayim was the Aristotle?
Yeah, maybe. It just didn't work.
Aristotle wasn't born yet. Yeah, you had the Ra.
Whatever. Might say that they believe that it's all nature. Why is the water and the sun and it's nature and nothing really changes? And Vayasi Chatim and Gam Ayla, they just showed that it's all part of nature. There is really no chiddush and everything was part of everything.
But it's just probably nicht damit.
No, but does the Ramban struggle in Chimish and Perish Ramban al Torah to say such things, to touch it around that way, or he just says it here? in this psikim about they did it that way too. They didn't believe. As a fruit. Does it say that in Chimish also?
Look, the Ramban talks about Chatim, but the Ramban has a different conversation about Chatim. Who's crying? Ich weiß nicht. Nein, the Ramban, like I'm saying, the Ramban kind of believed way too much of the Ramban, and because of that read the Torah anti-Ramban. But the anti-Ramban reading of the Torah is auch nicht emes. Es ist auch nicht the Pushte Pshat. The Pushte Pshat in the Torah is emes the Kasach named it's the Rambam, but the Rambam sagt, as a nes, as a get the Zach from the Rose from Mitzrayim, and being in Mitzrayim is bad, so obviously going out is good. And I don't think that we really need to add, and nicht not this, I think that it's really a bad way of conceptualizing everything by understanding that a nes has to break some law of nature, and that this whole idea of a nes is here to prove that God could break laws of nature. That's anyways outdated. In the Handige Zeiten, at least ich personally glaube nicht, was heißt laws of nature and some kind of real sense that causes things like by necessity or anything like that. So therefore, I go back to the very simple pshat of a nes, in my opinion, which is that a nes means that, like it means in the Chimish and like it means in the Divrei Chazal, push it. If you get saved or helped in an unexpected way, that's my minimalistic definition of a nes. Now, to search for ways of breaking laws of nature is kind of a very stupid thing to do nowadays, because there's no laws of nature. There's only statistics. And a nes basically means a statistical anomaly. And there's no way anything, the whole like search for like breaking laws of nature is a kind of impossible search. And my David Hume hat's gewissen and Zanavegen, it doesn't really make any sense, because the way we do science nowadays, if we'll find Kriyas Yamsef, then that will become the law of nature. It's only the whole idea of a less as breaking a law of nature only makes sense if you're in this real Aristotelian rationalist kind of world where you understand by yourself. We have to pretend that if there would be no oceans, Aristotle would figure out by himself that the ocean would have come every day, and the fact that it stopped one day can't be, and if it could be, it so proves that there is a God. But nobody has that kind of understanding of laws of nature anymore. So if it one day stopped, obviously it one day stopped. And mit Ausführungen verwusst, nicht alles versteht man ja, sie versteht man nicht. It doesn't really, there's not really a good way of showing anything or proving anything. It's a very stupid idea. And it's not only a stupid idea, it's not what it says in the Pusik. The Pusik steht keinmal nicht, als der Eibsche schluckt sich mit der Deva. The Pusik hat gar nicht gehört von der Idee von der Deva. And the Pusik is much closer to the reality that people understand today, which is that there's things that happen most of the time. Most days the Yamsuf goes one way. One day it went the other way, and it happened to be for us that it was the perfectly right day, and that's a nes. It's medafnish. I feel like
I'm thinking when man sagt das wegen as Yechiach, das steht dort by the what is it called, by the Sambatin Yechiach, because Sambatin is right, that's the nature of the world, that there's 7 days, 6 days, things that and the 7th day, it's not a nes. What?
No, you being able to do a nes might prove that you're special. But I don't think we have any of this issue with are there immutable laws of nature or is God beyond that? That whole question doesn't really make sense anymore. And therefore the whole Ramban's theology doesn't either.
But the Rambam theology also doesn't make, because if there is no law that God is helping the Jews with, if it's a statistical anomaly, then he's not doing it. What does it? Who cares about a statistical anomaly?
But of course, the Rambam
all said that I don't know anything. I didn't know.
But of course, the Rambam hat actually gehalten also, and the Rambam hat actually geglaubt dass, okay, whatever. If you read the Purkim of Ashgocha Brutus in the Rambam, you see that the Rambam actually doesn't believe that God does anything almost in the world. People do everything, almost everything. And
1 second, we had a problem. The Mitzrim were on our backs. We had to cross it to Mitzrayim.
Baruch Hashem, is raus. Now, this haben darf so nicht koich. This is der Rambam auch et moide.
Because we got it wrong beforehand. We just didn't know our numbers right.
No, because it's a way of training you to recognize the necessary being. That's really why. It's not, doesn't have to be true in the literal sense. The Rambam's Haidua and all these mitzvahs, even the famous Rambam wegen Ma'is Tzure darf man schreien. Of course, the Rambam doesn't really believe that the Tzure became because of that. The Rambam mostly believes that Tzure has become because people are stupid. But it's still, because the only thing that the Rambam cares about is that people should think about the first cause or the necessary being or whatever you want to call him. Then this is a good way, as good a way as any other way. And it's true in a certain sense because he's the first cause, so he's the cause of everything if you follow the chain of causes till the end. And what we call faith, what we call religious language in the Rambam's view, is just borrowing the first cause to jump him in like in the 75,000th cause in the middle. But that's all what that's really what the training is. But he doesn't really need there to be a real will or anything in between the first cause and what happens, because your mind is enough to connect those two things to the Rambam. That's why his theology actually has less of these problems, although of course he had the same view of nature, and that which is also wrong. But he didn't base his theology on being the opposite of the view of nature. He actually tried to base his theology on being with the view of nature as far as we could tell. And we'll try to say as much as we could, not to be apikorsim, So this is the whole Torah of the Ramban about Yetzias Mitzrayim. And when dem came to us, the Ramban, I'm going to noch a Sache, let's kick in the next page, kicking the Ramban's touch from the mitzvah and amina. The Ramban's mitzvah of amina actually means something very different than the Rambam's definition. And he doesn't seem to realize, or I'm not sure. If you read the Rambam had famously ausgetracht, this look letzte Woche auch, the Rambam hat ausgetracht the mitzvah von amina. Wie hat er so steht? Steht ab uns, Neuchi Hashem Lekeicho. And he even found the Mama Chazal that says, with a mushel von Amelech, Kibli Malchisi, v'achach kach Kibli Gzairoisa. Before me did the mitzvahs, darf man makabel sein, Malchus Shemaim, which the Rambam understood to mean you have to accept that there is a God, which is obviously a logical prerequisite also. But the Rambam also made it into a mitzvah somehow, and he said that this is the mitzvah, v'sayis Neuchi Hashem Elekeichu. Yet the Ramban in Zana Sogas hat Masken gewähnt mit the Rambam. This is a very good place to show. Ich habe jetzt Warte gebringt an Sogas von der Ramban wegen dem. Ich will noch was nehmen, Sogas von Ramban, das heißt mitzvah Aleph. So a very good place to see how the Ramban is influenced and following the Rambam, but actually says something very different than him. The Rambam zog, the Ramban is maskim. The Ramban is maskim to the Rambam. He zogt as maskim, and auch maskim to some shat from the mechilte. But if you'll go, let me go back to the Ramban in Parshas Shema Yisroi. If you'll read how the Ramban actually reads the mitzvah of Anochi and how he relates it to the Asheret Tzachzichum and Tzachzichum, this is in ganz anders than the Rambam's understanding. Kik was the Ramban zog, the Ramban zog, Anochi Hashem Lekeicho, Dibber as a mitzvah aside, so this is gepasst, as over the Rambam, this is a mitzvah. Omar Loichi Hashem, was meint, this Yoira v'yitzave oisam, she'yaydi v'yamini, so of course he's hedging himself, v'yaydi v'yamini, ki yesh Hashem, okay, v'hi alehim lohem, number 2, was meint this, keloimar, hoive kadmoin, okay, v'ite hoyu akol b'chayfetz v'yichoyles, but this is already Chiddush Oilam, v'hi Elohim lohem, and that's already a 4th or a 5th thing, as Elekeichu is dein Gott, shechiyuvim la'avoid oisoi. That's what it means. Omar Asher Tzachzichum, was heißt Asher Tzachzichum et Mitzrayim? Ke zu usam Sham Teure ala Metzias v'alachayv. This is mit der Ausgenommen die Jiden von Mitzrayim. This was avos Sai of the Eibish's Metzias and Sai of the Eibish's Roots. Das heißt, anti-kadmes oilam, which includes kibidia vashgucha many yitzuni misham. Right? As nit zanet gewesen, mir zanet kent mashgich. Aber gam teura ala chidish. Why? Kim kadmes oilam lo yishtana dove mit tibboy. That's the whole proof of the Ramban, how Yitzchok Chidish is gebot of the idea that if it would be Chidish kadmes oilam, nothing would be able to change. The Torah lechoilis, mile by choilis Torah la yichid. Nus vas yichid. What does it mean yichid? By yichid it means that he's the only one that manages everything. Kein anders kann man sagen was das. Aber das steht kibar vitaida. Das steht as tzesichu. Kein mayoidem weiß. Wie bald das tzesichu. So the Ramban reads asher tzesichu. Wie bald asher tzesichu. Weiß die as alehechu as ich bin hachofetz hayuchel va mashgiach and all of that. If you look in the Rambam, how he says the mitzvah of Nechei Hashem Nekechu, he doesn't have not close to as many words. Ob the Rambam hat der Psainin von Ashguch is sicher nicht daran, like there is sicher nicht daran in the mitzvah of Nechei Hashem Nekechu. Veloi the Elo, jede single move the Rambam quote the Pusik of Nechei Hashem Nekechu, he skips the rest of the Pusik, which is at Shef Tzich Meretz Mitzrayim. So you could actually look in. You could actually look in so gewissen letzten Mal, alle drei Plätze, wie der Rambam bringt die Pusik, und lehnt aus der Limit, skippt die ganze Asher Tzich Mitzrayim. Seht bechlall nicht, als Asher Tzich ist ein wichtiger Part von das. While according to the Ramban, ohne Asher Tzich wird man nicht gewiss, keine von den Sachen, was sind Elekeichum. And besides for that, the Ramban actually includes in this mitzvah of Visnas Duagot, includes this whole story of Chufetz, Chayf, Choiles, Vashgucha, and the other Sachen. Was the Rambam, though he probably believes in them, definitely doesn't include it in the idea of Metzias Hashem, which is very purely just Sheyesh Hashem in the Rambam's view. So the Ramban's Emine, the Ramban's basic amina, like first ikr, is totally different than the Rambam's first ikr, and it actually is what we could only know from Yitzias Mitzrayim, nicht from